In this video lecture, we will go over primary source analysis. Specifically, we will look at George Kennan's long telegram, sent in February of 1946. In doing so, it should give you an idea of how to go about analyzing Nikolai Novikov's telegram, sent in September of 1946. To begin, let's get some background on George Kennan. George Kennan was an American diplomat stationed in Moscow during the early years of the Cold War. He was prompted by Washington to give his thoughts on Soviet plans. Kennan responded with what became known as the Long Telegram. The Long Telegram is a significant U.S. document because it outlined what became the United States Cold War foreign policy. Namely, it outlined the containment policy. The idea of the containment policy was that the United States would contain communism where it existed at that point in time. It would not let it expand anywhere else. In other words, the United States would prevent the Soviets from expanding its borders, its power, and its influence. Nikolai Novikov was in some sense Kennan's counterpart. He was the Soviet ambassador to the United States, and while he was stationed in Washington, D.C., he wrote a telegram back to the foreign minister Molotov that outlined the United States' policy, or rather his view of U.S. policy and the U.S. outlook. In doing so, he helped shape Soviet policy. It should be noted that Western scholars did not have access to Novikov's telegram until after 1990, when the source became available to the West. The reason it did not become available until that time is because 1990 is at the end of the Cold War. It's after the Berlin Wall fell, and yet right before the Soviet Union collapses. It's important to note that because all Cold War history is written before 1990, or really before the mid-1990s in the United States, lack access to Soviet documents. So in some sense, they're only based on half the story. As we go through the sources, keep in mind who wrote what, when, where, and why. These are essential questions for analyzing any primary document. On to Kennan's telegram. Remember that we cannot use Kennan's source alone to make claims about Soviet intentions. To make such claims, we would need to fact-check Kennan's statements by investigating a number of Soviet internal documents that would better show the Soviet mindset. Instead, what we can learn from Kennan's document is what Kennan thought, how Kennan viewed the Soviet Union, or rather, more specifically, how Kennan viewed the Soviet views of the United States. So what does his telegram tell us about his views? To begin, let's look at the second A section of part 1. It's below the G section, and it follows the sentence, "So much for premises. To what deductions do they lead from standpoint of Soviet policy?" To following. In the second A section of part 1, Kennan wrote, quote, "Everything must be done to advance relative strength of USSR as factor in international society. Conversely, no opportunity must be missed to reduce strength and influence, collectively as well as individually, of capitalist powers." Now we need to remember that in part 1, what Kennan was doing was he was writing his view of the Soviet view. So it's what Kennan thinks the Soviets think. So from Kennan's perspective, the Soviets think that everything must be done to advance their own strength, the strength of the Soviet Union, as a factor in international society, and that they also cannot allow the capitalist powers to gain any power whatsoever. So Kennan's concluding here that the Soviets were aggressive in their foreign policy, right? From his perspective, he thinks that the Soviets are aggressive, right? This statement right here would suggest that the Soviets are aggressive. If the Soviets really think that everything that they're doing has to increase their own strength and decrease the strength of the capitalists, then that means it's the Soviets who are aggressive. Now, remember, this is not the Soviet view, this is Kennan's view. So Kennan is concluding that the Soviets were aggressive in their foreign policy. In his mind, all Soviet actions were done to increase Soviet power and decrease the power of the United States, which was the most powerful capitalist power at that time. In the second C section, in part 1, Kennan wrote that the Soviet plan included, quote, democratic progressive elements abroad are to be utilized to maximum to bring pressure to bear on capitalist governments along lines agreeable to Soviet interests. So Kennan is saying that this is the Soviet view, right? So Kennan's statement shows that Kennan thought that the Soviets would work with people within the United States to undermine the U.S. system. He believed that the Soviets would secretly infiltrate the U.S. through American leftists. Again, this would be an aggressive action on the Soviet side. From Kennan's perspective, he sees the Soviets as acting aggressively. So if the government was to adopt such a line of thinking, as from later documents we know that it did, then it would fear that anyone who believed in any progressive reforms was a communist. So it would see Americans who are progressive as possibly being communist. This would be for the ones who took it the furthest, though. In part 3, we see Kennan shift to his assumptions about specific Soviet plans. So let's turn now to part 3 of Kennan's telegram to look at Kennan's assumptions about the specific Soviet plans. Kennan, in sections A and B of part 3, claimed that the Soviets were pursuing an aggressive and expansionist policy. Let's take a look. In section A, Kennan wrote, quote, internal policy devoted to increasing in every way strength and prestige of Soviet state, intensive military industrialization, maximum development of armed forces, great displays to impress outsiders, continued secretness about internal matters, designed to conceal weaknesses and to keep opponents in the dark. We can see from this section that Kennan thinks that the Soviets are aggressive, that they're building up their military. Why do people build up their military? To look strong, to get ready for a war, to play a more aggressive role. And although Kennan points out that all of this is to conceal weakness and to keep opponents in the dark, suggesting that from Kennan's perspective, he thinks that the Soviets have an inferiority complex. But that's only the cause of why the Soviets are acting aggressive. That's not meaning that the Soviets are not acting aggressive in Kennan's view. From Kennan's perspective, the Soviets are an aggressive power. In section B, he said, wherever it is considered timely and promising, efforts will be made to advance official limits of Soviet power. For the moment, these efforts are restricted to certain neighboring points conceived of here as being of immediate strategic necessity, such as northern Iran, right? And he goes on from there. So what's significant about what Kennan is writing here is that he thinks not only will the Soviets parade around and show that they have a strong military, but that they'll actually, when given the opportunity, they'll expand their power outside of their borders. They'll go and at least influence, at this point, neighboring countries. But later on, if they have the opportunity, they'll go beyond that, according to Kennan. And so the effect of this would be, if we scan down below, thus a friendly Persian government might be asked to grant Russia a port on the Persian Gulf. Should Spain fall under communist control, questions of Soviet base at Gibraltar Strait might be activated. So what Kennan is implying here is that what the Soviets want to do is not only build up their military, but also create more strategic bases throughout at least Europe, if not beyond those points. In part 5, we see Kennan's suggestions of U.S. policy. If we look at the end of the first paragraph, we see where Kennan said, and in support of this conviction, there are certain observations of a more encouraging nature I should like to make. In section 1, he argued, quote, it does not take unnecessary risks. It, in this case, means the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union does not take unnecessary risks, impervious to logic of reason, and it is highly sensitive to logic of force. For this reason, it can easily withdraw, and usually does when strong resistance is encountered at any point. Thus, if the adversary has sufficient force and makes clear his readiness to use it, he rarely has to. What Kennan implied here was that if the United States built up its military force and showed that it was ready to go to the brink with the Soviets, that the Soviets would back down. This is significant for forming U.S. policy and the U.S. policy mindset throughout the Cold War, that the U.S. thinks it needs to show that it's strong. But Kennan saying this actually thinks that this is the U.S. acting defensively against the aggressive Soviet power. So for Kennan, the United States is going to build up its military, not because it's an aggressive power that wants to take over the world, but because it needs to show that it has sufficient force to defend against the Soviet Union, to make the Soviets not be aggressive. So what Kennan is implying throughout his entire long telegram is that the Soviets are an aggressive power, and so the United States is going to have to act defensively in order to counter that Soviet aggression. Now that we have gone over some of the sections, it is your turn. As you go through, remember to keep in mind who said what, when, where, and why. Avoid taking what either diplomat said as absolute fact about the other side's mindset and policy. Remember that as you go through Novikov's telegram, that it's Novikov's view of the United States' view of the Soviet Union. You can't take what Novikov is saying about the United States' views as absolute fact. You have to take it within the context of this is what Novikov said in 1946. So Kennan viewed the Soviet Union as an aggressive power and so believed that the U.S. should defend against the aggressive power. Did Novikov view the U.S. as aggressive or defensive? Think about this as you're going through Novikov's source. How did he think the Soviets should respond? From the Soviet perspective, did the Soviets seek to gain influence over Eastern European countries because it viewed itself as aggressive or because it saw itself as acting defensively? So as you're going through Novikov's telegram, think of this, right? From Novikov's perspective, did the Soviets seek to gain influence over Eastern European countries because they saw themselves as aggressive, or because the Soviet Union thought that it was acting defensively? Think about this as you go through, and then think about the two documents together and what they tell us about the origins of the Cold War. As always, let me know if you have any questions.